Welcome to the podcast. Okay, this one was special. I had Sidhaarth and Atthulyaa on for this one, both of who are doctors and longtime friends of mine. For the first time on this podcast, I had people who actually knew what they were talking about, actual experts in the field we were discussing. This was a pleasant surprise, and I absolutely enjoyed our conversation. I also think that this episode would be valuable to almost anyone really, given the current state of things. Not surprisingly, we talk about COVID-19. We talk about when life might return to normal, in air quotes. We talk about being prepared for future pandemics. We talk about AI in medicine, and much more. Without further delay, I bring you episode 6 of the podcast. Hey guys, thanks for being on the podcast. I know you two are really busy people and I appreciate you being on. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Okay. I'm hoping this one's going to be a really interesting one, especially given the circumstances. So I was hoping that you guys could give the listeners a basic understanding of what this virus really is and how the coronavirus or the strand that causes COVID-19 is different from a regular influenza virus.
Yeah, okay. Basically, it's just the same. It causes regular symptoms like cough, fever, body pain. In some people, it's said to cause other atypical symptoms. It affects everybody. It's like common flu. But the thing is that in any person who has less immunity, or he or she has any other comorbidities like diabetes or hypertension or any immunosuppression like cancer or undergoing any treatment, he or she is affected more, basically. It just affects your lungs, and people are said to say, and it is said that it reduces your lung capacity and you require a more intensive therapy after that.
So I've heard a lot of talk about strands and like certain strands being more prevalent in Europe and others being spread in New York and California. Is there something different about the virus, even from a geographical standpoint, or is it all the same?
Let me answer the question for you. The thing is that all viruses have multiple strands, and it's all because of mutation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the generally mutation is based on acclimatization to the conditions in which the virus has been put in.
Okay.
So the strands in Europe, the mother strand was the same thing, which was from Wuhan, which you all know, and maybe it had adapted differently in New York and differently in European countries. Is what's my take on it, and that's how there are multiple strands of viruses anyway. And the main differentiating factor between a normal flu and COVID is the rate of contagiousness, because like a common flu can spread from one person to another one person, but for COVID the ratio is 1.7.
Okay, so this is the R0 value that everyone's talking about right now.
Yeah.
Okay. You say that a geographical location can have an effect on how the virus reacts to a certain person.
It's not a geographical location per se. It is how the virus mutates according to the person it affects, basically. The strand from the original strand, the original virus, which was started in Wuhan, is not what we see in Italy. It's not what we see right now in India. There's a bit of mutation. There's not much of mutation is what we've been hearing right now. That's why it is very difficult to find a vaccine for such a virus. It's constantly mutating.
Okay. Let's talk a little about what the situation is in the places that you guys are in right now. So how's the situation in India? How's the situation in my hometown, Sidhaarth?
Okay, so as I work in a government setup, almost all cases which have even a small suspicion of COVID are sent here.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest trouble which doctors here have are convincing patients that what you have is not COVID. The panic is too high here. And the reason of the panic is literacy. There's a sudden lockdown because there's a fever kind of illness going around, and anyone with fever thinks they have corona and they come here. So the doctors have a very difficult time convincing them that they don't need a test, because the problem in India actually is that we don't have we are not having enough testing kits as other countries do.
Hmm.
So we need to see which people really need the test. So that's why we had a criteria of travel history for a long time.
Hmm.
So only people with travel history had to be tested. But over the course, now that we have more testing kits, yet the testing has improved quite a bit. But still, the cases have not increased due to the lockdown, I believe.
So that's some good news here. What about you, Atulya?
Basically, we don't have much of a problem in Kerala per se, because they were quick to react to this to the emergency rather. And I work in a private setup, so we do not have the authority of the government to have COVID cases in our hospital. So
Hmm.
we generally, what we had to do was screen all our patients basically at all entry points of the hospital. We used to ask them for their travel history and any symptomatology, because we know the COVID hotspots in and around the entire state.
So it looks like it started off with tracing people through travel history, and now it has kind of migrated back into looking for symptomatic carriers. From what Siddharth is saying, is that also reflected in Kerala, or are they still going off of travel history?
Kerala has traced almost everybody, and there are so many people in home quarantine currently, even now.
Hmm.
Our home quarantine criteria is moved up to 30 days after
Hmm.
after you've come to India. So I think they're doing a pretty good job at that, Kerala.
Okay. So from what I'm hearing, it looks like, at least from the perspective of a person living in the US, it does look like India has dealt with this issue at a much faster rate and have responded way quicker and more effectively than the US. My fear really was that the population density in India was going to make it really hard, but hearing from you guys has made me more optimistic. And yeah, I think we're headed in the right direction as India goes. Do you guys feel the same?
Yeah, it looks
Yeah.
like that. Definitely.
The thing is that the Indian crowd is a very scared crowd.
Hmm.
They act like they are rough and but deep down they are scared of everything. So when the government said that if you come out you will die, people really thought something big is going on and they stayed home. It's a very big thing which contributed to the better prognosis of India in this crisis.
And another thing that I feel is worth mentioning here, at least comparing the United States and India, I feel like there's a lot more respect for science in India, at least compared to the US. There just seems to be almost a militant disagreement with anything scientific in the US. Like, there's just a lot of people who are against institutionalized science, especially because universities and science has kind of been associated with the political left in the last few decades in the US. So it's become more partisan than it should be, and I don't see that problem as much in India. I feel like a lot of people, if there's enough science to back something up, will believe it. And the US seems to have a huge problem convincing people about facts, and I think that's a big problem in society in general. And I feel that that's happening more in the developed world compared to countries like India. But yeah, I think that's taking the topic slightly off of where I want it to be. But I'd really want to get into the future of things, and where and when we can decide that it's safe for us to go back to our normal lives. What would you guys put down as key markers as to when it's safe to go back to living a normal life post COVID?
Okay, so basically, to be very honest, I think to return to how it was before, we need a vaccine to come out, basically. Because there is, uh, if people are allowed to move freely, if all the transportation starts once again, people are allowed to move between districts, between states, and inter countries, there might be a second wave of COVID.
Mm.
And Kerala primarily is preparing for the second wave very intensively, to be very honest. They're just watching out for all the signs, and with all the expatriates being coming from the Gulf countries to Kerala, they are actually anticipating a second wave. So for all things to return to normal, to going out and eating at restaurants, to going to movie theaters, to having fun together, to get together, I think you'd have to wait for a vaccine. Yeah.
And like
Okay.
most people are saying, is that 18 months from now? Would that be an accurate number?
Actually, no. There are 19 contenders for a vaccine currently. And the top contender is the vaccine produced from being tried out at at Oxford University. They already reached their stage 3 clinical trials, and around and simultaneously they are being mass produced in India. Actually, at this point of time, so they're expecting, if the trials go successfully, they're expecting vaccines to be out by September 2020. Actually.
Oh, that's good news. And Sidhaarth, you had some input there?
Yeah, actually, my thought is that it's going to take exactly like you said, like about 18 months to come back to like normal life, as you say, within air quotes. Because I think life will return, but it would be with restrictions. It would be with face masks, people wearing face masks every day, people going out, maintaining social distancing. But returning back to normal would take a really long time. Because even if there's a vaccine, we cannot say that there will never not be one new case a day, right? We can never say that there are no cases of COVID in the world ever again, because to eradicate a disease is too big a task.
Yes, it's taken decades for us, right, to get a few of those out. So the quickest one that comes to mind is polio, and that took us. Yeah, it's small. Yeah, and how long did that take us? So I think that leads conveniently to my next question. Is that really our goal with COVID-19? Is it a realistic goal to try and wipe out the disease before we ever go back to normal life? Or who decides if the risk or the number of patients affected in the world is low enough that we can go back to being who we were? So let's say 10% of the population can be affected with COVID, and we can still continue operations as normal. I think 10% is a huge number, but you get what I'm trying to say. It's like, will there be a stage in the future where you could pass off on a certain number of people being sick because there's just no realistic way to get that number down to zero?
I'd agree with you, actually. There's no realistic way to get the number to zero at all. In the near future, at least, the next 2 years. I think that at least when the affected people are less than 10% of the population, and we have enough cure and we have enough vaccines or enough healthcare professionals to look after those sick people, I think it's time for life to return to normal, rather. Instead of waiting for the entire virus to get eradicated. That's not going to be possible anyhow or any time I see in the near future.
And what do you think, Sidhaarth?
Okay, the thing about a pandemic is that it's a disease, and it's not just like something which happens seasonally or happens only that 1 year. Like, we still have case of plague, we still have case of Spanish flu, we still have case of the recent epidemic of chikungunya. Even though it's not a very big thing to talk about, there are still cases, and we know how to treat them now. The thing is, we just need to have the technical knowledge to treat these kinds of cases. When we know how to treat a case with COVID, I think it will be easier to move on from there.
So I think I'm playing devil's advocate here, but from the mortality rates that we are seeing around the world, would you not agree that we do kind of know how to treat COVID? Yeah, we don't have a vaccine, but there are diseases out there that have a higher mortality rate than COVID. So why is the reason that this disease, COVID-19, has forced the entire world to go down into lockdown? and other diseases have not. Is this pointing back to the R naught number that you talked about, or is it just because it's a new disease?
Exactly, this is because of the contingency factor.
Mm.
Because any other disease which kills mostly non-communicable, talking about diabetes, hypertension, or any other heart diseases which we say have a higher death rate than COVID,
Mm.
are all non-communicable. This is the
Mm.
first case of like a disease which spread from person to person to create such a mortality.
Mm.
In recent history, with a heavier media involvement in day-to-day life, which is a very important part of this pandemic being seeming bigger than it is actually.
Hmm. Okay, so Elon Musk is definitely wrong.
Of course, it's not.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's switch topics and go on to something a little more philosophical, I feel. And this is an argument that's a raging debate, at least in the United States. Um, where do you think the line is drawn between economic downfall and catastrophe and saving someone's life? So this has been a huge debate in the United States, saving the economy versus saving lives of 1,000 people. And to me, it seems like a no-brainer. Like as long as uh, some part of the economy is functional and people have basic necessities, the the priority has to be human life. But there has been a lot of points that have been made from the other side that I think are worth considering. Like, for example, you cannot have people on daily labor who are not effectively supported by government, and they're just gonna starve to death essentially if they don't have uh, any other means of income. So there's a lot of fear about increased criminal activity, increased theft, violence. Where do you think the line has to be drawn? Is should it be completely on the government to take care of the people economically in this time, or do you think there's a better way to deal with it?
Okay, I think the line comes when the economy cannot support the healthcare.
Hmm.
Do you get me? Because the country's healthcare is almost dependent on the country's economic status. Only if the country has money to provide medications or whatever facilities needed to provide healthcare, will there be healthcare.
Okay. So,
I'm not talking on an individual basis, but I'm talking about as the government in whole. As long as the government can fund medical work and medical research about this pandemic, I think they can go on doing this. When and if a time comes when the government cannot pay money for the healthcare providers, cannot provide money for the healthcare workers, then we think about letting people die and having the economy grow back.
mm, but what about the people who are not sick and don't know where their next meal is coming from? That really seems to be, at least with parts of North India that we saw, that seems to be the biggest pushback. Really, is that the government is not doing enough to keep them fed.
But isn't
And
that why we had voted and selected a leader to be a part of the government to help us in
exactly,
the time of crisis?
yes, like yeah, that's my point really. Like I would completely agree with that. It has to be on the government to take care of these people, but it's an interesting debate that I feel has again been polarized into partisan groups in the US, and in India it seems to be affecting a lot of day-to-day workers. So do you have any input on this, Atulya, or uh, do you firmly believe it has to be health over economy?
It is supposed to be health over economy, but I understand the plight of those manual laborers all over the country. I think, I don't know, it's really sad to watch them, but then health, human life always plays a huge, bigger role than the economy, always, according to me.
Yeah, this I think this is where there has to be some criticism of the government. uh, I feel like they could have done a better job, and I also empathize with the limits as to how much the government can do. I think they have been rolling out rations. They have been trying to like do everything possible from the government side of things. But yeah, I think this is something that we were definitely not prepared for, and I think it's taken most countries by surprise.
I feel like the southern states of India, like Kerala and Tamil Nadu, they have set up a lot of community kitchens. So even those people who are being, passed over by central government schemes or their rations, I think people, rather the people who have community kitchens, just the general public are doing a huge role in supporting those people in Kerala.
Okay. Does seem to be all optimism from you guys' end, so it's really good to hear. And it's I have to say it's a bit of a contrast from what I'm hearing from people around in the US, so it's really good to hear that. And talking about how this pandemic took us by surprise, uh, I really believe that that should not have been the case. So um, a pandemic like this was just bound to happen. If you looked at what all the scientists were saying in the last 2 decades, and but why were we so underprepared? Why was nobody expecting this? Why were there shortages of ventilators, and why was uh, wet market still a thing? Why do you think that we were so underprepared for this pandemic?
I think that we were, rather than underprepared, we didn't know what was coming. We knew something was coming, but we didn't know what was coming. Is it going to be respiratory illness? Is it going to be some other kind of illness? It was a major thing in being prepared.
Interpolating this like forward, I'm pretty sure you'll agree with me that this is not going to be the last global pandemic that we're going to be faced with. So how do we prepare for the next one? And I totally agree with you that there's no way to know or no way to expect what type of virus or bacteria we're going to see next. But is there any way in which we could be prepared for the next one?
I think the response of the public, of the government, should have been faster. And I think it will be faster in the next coming pandemic. So now, because we've had an experience right now, so I think people will be better prepared about going into lockdown, going into complete shutdown, the economic going down. I think the government will be better prepared next time when it comes.
Is there anything that we can do to prevent the virus outbreak in the first place? Do we have like things that could stop happening? So the easiest one for me would be wet markets. Are there like any other hotspots from which we could stop these kind of global, extremely virulent viruses from appearing? So I have heard at least a few people suggest that the entire planet goes vegan. I think that's a bit of an overreaction right there, but would that actually make a difference?
There is no way to stop a complete global pandemic. There are going to be new organisms, there are going to be new viruses, new bacteria sprouting out of nowhere. Even if you stop all these wet markets, what if a random bat comes and bites you? That's what happened with the Nipah virus in 2019 in Kerala. A random bat caused it didn't cause a pandemic because people responded faster and contained it to just 4 or 5 people within the state. But what if it started the same way? And viruses do keep mutating all the time. You can't stop it.
And the thing is, I don't think the next pandemic or even the last few pandemics, they haven't been bacterial, parasitic or fungal, because all those, the range of variations and mutations is so less that it can be treated with the same kind of medication which we have now. The thing about virus is the mutation and variations are dramatically different from one generation to the other.
So what is this that I've been hearing about a few people being involved with developing a multi-spectrum viral vaccination that works on multiple strands of the influenza virus? I think Bill Gates was involved in this. Is this something that we can see helping out moving forward? Or
the thing about developing multi-spectrum and broad spectrum antibiotics or antivirals is it leads way to resistance and tolerance, which will be the next topic, as you were saying. The development of drug resistant viruses and those things will be common when we have a broader spectrum, and when these antivirals are used left and right,
You get more drug-resistant strands, is what
yes,
you're trying
yes.
to say, right? Yes. Okay, yeah. So I think that's a good segue right into drug-resistant bacteria. So I think I had a conversation with my friend about 4 or 5 years ago about drug-resistant bacteria and how he feared that we're going to run out of efficient antibiotics to, um, take care of these. I think the global consensus, or at least a lot of people that I see on the internet, seem to be worried about stagnation of antibiotic research, and and we might just have a superbug that is completely resistant to any kind of antibiotic we have. Uh, how worried are you about such a scenario, and is that something that people should be thinking about?
It is a very dire scenario, superbugs formation. Uh, but we are taking a bit of measures to control, to stop that rather. Generally, antibiotics used to be available over the counter. You go to any pharmaceutical shop anywhere, if you ask them for an antibiotic, they'll happily give you no questions asked. For
Mm,
treat for any fever, common cold, people just go get an antibiotic.
mm,
But now we don't prescribe antibiotics arbitrarily for any fever, common cold, any common infection. Only when
mm,
um, only when a stage has been reached, like basically antimicrobials. Only when a stage has been reached, like the patient actually needs antimicrobials, we are prescribing them rather instead of just
mm,
arbitrarily giving it to any random Tom, Dick, and Harry who just comes into the room.
mm. So I think the biggest complaint, or the biggest qualm people had with superbugs, is that we seem to have stagnated in antibiotic technology, in the sense, like, I don't know if this is accurate, but I hear that most antibiotics are still based off of penicillin. I think a lot of people seem to be pushing for research into a different approach to antibiotics. I completely agree with your point about abuse of antibiotics and creating these superbugs in the first place. But how prepared are we for a superbug after it has already been created?
I don't
We
think we are
aren't.
prepared for a superbug,
Yeah, we aren't.
because the thing about the superbug is we don't know what it's going to be resistant to, right?
Hmm.
And if we find a higher antibiotic to the one we have now, how can we hold it off until the superbug comes and not use it for a care for someone who has a disease now,
Hmm.
which is the biggest dilemma here.
Hmm.
Finding a medicine for something for a disease which hasn't come yet is seems like a good idea theoretically, but I don't think it can be done practically first.
Hmm.
So the best way to go about handling a superbug or a drug resistance is like reducing abuse of antibiotics. And rather than the word of stagnation for antibiotic research, I think we have reached a saturation.
Hmm.
We know all that is there to know about the bacteria. We know all the stages of its growth, and we have a antibiotic to kill it in every stage. I don't think there's a level after this in bacterial growth,
Hmm. I'm
and
glad
that's
that
why people have turned their heads towards viruses.
Hmm.
Now, viruses are the next big thing as per scientists and research.
Okay. I'm just glad that the experts on this field are much less alarmist than I am, and you guys are more grounded than I am, I think. So, what do you guys think is the role of automation, machine learning, and artificial intelligence in medicine? Is it already being widely used? Where do you guys see technology creeping into? Where do you see this kind of technology creeping into medicine in the coming decades?
I think that the next field which technology is going to enter is medicine, because medicine is still one field which is mostly people based, most
Mm,
and has the biggest chance of error, human error. And I think the next biggest, okay, wait for a few seconds. Okay, the next big wave of technology would be medical equipments and medical trackers and those kind of devices associated with healthcare.
mm. And do you take the same stance, Atulya? Or, like, do you think AI
Uh,
is?
I think they have a bigger role in surgeries rather than in medicine, actually. Because there's a high amount of precision with which uh, uh, AI can help with. Like right now, we do have robotic surgeries currently. In my hospital, we have this robot called Da Vinci and this robot called Rosa, which help in all neurosurgeries basically because they are very precise and their arms are very small and they have a very high degree of mobility and rotation. So they can perform cuts or anything which a human hand can't possibly do. So I just think there's a more segue for surgeries, like very like all microscopic surgeries to be done by robot by AI rather than in diagnostics.
Hmm. That's an interesting point, and I also feel I think most of the current developments also agree with what you're saying. I think fields like radiology, there's a lot of scope for vision systems in AI that help. They can identify tumors way more accurately than humans can. As far as diagnostics goes, I think I agree with you guys. I know I was when we had this conversation about a year ago. I took a different stance against Siddharth. I think it was like I strongly believed that even diagnostics done, uh, uh, could be automated, but uh, I've been thinking about it, and I think there's a little more nuance to
Right.
diagnosis, especially uh, patients coming in to see their doctor, I guess. But theoretically speaking, in the long run, I see diagnosis as basically information processing, right? There's variables to be determined. You have any kind of diagnosis of a disease is basically based on certain observations that you make on the patient. And if we have the technology to be able to do that, I feel like it's not out of the realm of possibility, maybe in the next 50, 60 years, for that to become a reality. But uh, I think I would agree with you that right now that's not the case. From the viewpoint of a doctor, what do you think is lost when you automate certain things about medicine?
Yeah. When a patient comes to see you basically in an OPD, I think a lot matters on how you treat, how you respond to the patient and his queries. I don't think an AI or any machine can, respond to the way, um, you know, the way a human does rather. Probably it could be even, it could be more accurate. But
Hmm.
half the patient's problems go away when you actually listen to him say his problems, hear him out, and that sort of is lost when you just go, go uh, go to a machine. And that
Hmm.
human small talk, rather, I don't know what you'd call that, is very important, I feel, when you're treating patients. That helps a lot
Hmm.
in creating a rapport, in creating a bond. So the patient tends to listen to you more when you have a rapport with him. He tends to stick to his prescriptions. He tends to come back to you, tends to listen to what we tell him and believe it more rather than some machine telling him, you know what, you have this, use this. That will be lost.
Hmm.
Compliance would be lost.
I Yeah, I think this was the exact same things that Siddharth told me when we had this conversation about a year ago. And has that changed, Siddharth?
No, actually, I still do believe that, but I think a machine can be, an AI can really be helpful in assisting a doctor during diagnosis. Unlike when I had the opposite thing of this, I believe a machine can shortlist a few conditions which a doctor may have overseen or something, which may help the doctor have a better view of the disease, of the patient, I mean. And the other thing is, the thing about an AI doctor is that health is state of physical and mental well-being.
Hmm.
And as we see the increase with online doctors and people consulting Google, we see there's an increase with mental disorders.
Hmm.
I think that the world is a community and you cannot live without other people.
Mm.
So I think just going to a doctor's check, seeing a friend, maybe it's the contact you need to cure yourself from the disease.
That's a really interesting point there. Uh, okay, so now that you've quashed my fears about the AI taking over the world, let's move on to something else. Uh, One thing that I've been worrying about, especially in the post-COVID world, is that COVID might become a reason for governments to increase the rate of surveillance on people, right? So I think it's already being done in certain countries through uh, a mobile app. I think in South Korea, it worked really well. It helped them curb the spread of the disease and flatten the curve really fast. So I believe, or I fear rather, that surveilling people might become the new normal in the post-COVID world, and this might not be all for the good, right? Like, I know we had this conversation slightly before we started this topic, and I do agree with what you said at the start about the fact that people are already doing it to themselves using fitness trackers and heart rate monitors and whatnot. My real my real concern is that we might live in a world where everything that you do is essentially like a huge job interview, right? A good example of this would be Angelina Jolie, who had a mastectomy because she carried the genes that was associated with a higher risk of breast cancer. Now, in a world where constant surveillance of human genes is a thing, in that future, this kind of preemptive procedures might become the new normal, right? So if government agencies or any agency for that matter has information on your genetics and they warn you that you have a higher risk of contracting a certain kind of disease maybe 30 years from now, and then you chose to ignore it, you might be deemed irresponsible in that society. Um, Insurance companies are going to hesitate to cover you. You might have problems getting bank loans and whatnot. So you're going to be looked at as an outcast in that society. I feel like this kind of continuous surveillance of one's health might not be for the good. And I feel like governments might use this global pandemic to push forward on this kind of surveillance. And I feel it might be intrusive to everyday life, maybe 10 years from now. So I don't know if you guys have thought about this before, but I would like to get your input on that.
Well, I think this brings us back to the biggest debate every medical student or medical professional has had with his mind and with his colleagues: pro-life or pro-choice.
Hmm.
So people who have the pro-choice attitude would say that this kind of surveillance is wrong, and that I am allowed to do what I want with my life.
Hmm.
And the thing is that people with this pro-life attitude can have that attitude, but they should not push this on the leftist crowd, as you say.
Hmm.
So it's about being in harmony with what the other people chooses to believe in, rather than trying to push your agenda over the others.
Hmm. Is this the same stance that you have, Atulya? Like,
Yeah, it's a freedom of choice rather. But then everyone, we are inevitably, surveilling ourselves, and we are, updating it in our apps, or people have our medical records. It's all electronic nowadays. So anyway, people can get into what they actually want, even if you aren't actually surveilling them, rather.
hmm.
But then there are stringent laws against, privacy as of now. But then I'd agree with what Sidhaarth said, actually. It's freedom of choice at
Hmm.
the end of the day.
I think that the pro-choice people should be allowed to have their choice unless their choice affects another person who is not related to them. Like in case of this pandemic, if you want to go around and get the disease, but the problem is that if you might meet someone else and you transfer the disease to them, right?
Hmm.
In any other case, if someone has a risk of heart disease, says that I don't want to check myself, I'll live my life smoking, drinking, and doing whatever I want. It's their choice, and it doesn't harm anyone else, right?
Hmm.
Unless it harms someone else, I think they must be allowed to do what they want.
Okay, I think that works for today's society, but my fear really is that health might be used as an excuse for mass surveillance in other aspects of life as well. One can easily imagine a world where self-driving is the new norm and the government is constantly surveilling for human drivers, and insurance companies may deem these people uninsurable. But in an objective sense, this seems like the way to go, right? Yes, constant surveillance of human health will make the world more disease free. Enforcement of self driving cars will definitely bring down the number of car crashes. But then, where do you draw the line, though? Where do you stop? Um, what if the government decides that a certain way of thinking is better than another? With enough surveillance data on your social media feed, the government can basically know what every one of its citizens are thinking and take actions based off of that. I talked about this a little bit on my previous podcast, but and yeah, that's the punchline really. Even if surveillance is for the greater good, the freedom of choice really gets disregarded here once you go into mass surveillance. So the the dilemma really is between having an objectively higher quality of life versus your freedom. Again, that kind of gets into a philosophical domain, but yeah, that's something I've been thinking of. So, if you guys have any input on that, we can talk about it, or we can move on.
Yeah, I'd like to add something on that. I
Yep.
don't think the corporate world is going to strike off from people who are pro-choice. I think they're going to have something like a higher premium to people with pro-choice attitude,
Hmm.
and they're
Yeah,
still going
exactly.
to try to make money out of
Even
it.
that, right? So there's incentive to live one kind of way over the other. So uh, yeah, that's really what I fear. Like external factors influencing the way that we lead our lives is something I worry about.
So you don't think external factors are influencing the way you live now?
Well, it does. I guess the new baseline might be way higher in the future, is what I'm trying to say. I guess.
And maybe that's the way we evolve.
Hmm. Okay. So I think this has been really informative, and I've learned a lot of things in the last hour or so. And I want to hand it off to you guys and on what you guys are working on and what you guys think are going to be the biggest breakthroughs in medicine moving forward in the next 2 decades or so. What you guys think are the biggest problems medicine is faced with in the coming years, and any other input on that?
Okay, let me
Hello.
go.
Hmm.
I think the biggest problem that medicine, not the problem, but medicine is trying to do something which I believe will be the problem to medicine again, which is genetically modified human beings.
Hmm.
Like trying to create a person without any kind of any kind of flaws as we see it now.
Hmm.
I think it's better to like identify the genetic makeup of a person and correct it then than trying to create the perfect gene.
Hmm.
And I also believe that the next stage in medicine is going to be more of including technology into the human body, like bionics and neural implants and those kinds of things.
Hmm.
Because I think there has been research about neural implants helping people with Parkinson's walk normally, people with paralysis being able to walk, which is I think is the next biggest thing in medicine right now.
Okay. Before I have Atulya talk on her part, I think you made something that was too interesting for me to pass up on. So, uh, about genetically modified humans. Uh, so, I think this kind of ties into what I was saying before about making humans less and less vulnerable to all kind of diseases, and also I think if you genetically modify a human, you can also actively make them superhuman, right? Have a higher IQ than anyone else. And the fear for me about most of this is that it might lead to this whole tier of humanity that is way more intelligent, way stronger, resistant to all kind of diseases. And I'd expect this to, at least initially, only make it to people in power or people who are rich, right? So I expect society to be broken into this class of superhumans and the rest of the world. And uh, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, and I fear about too. So is there any way we could stop this from happening? Do you think it has to be government imposed laws, or how do you think we should deal with this?
I don't think we would have to deal with this because, as per history, any hybrid which has been created is sterile or unfertile.
Mm.
Like the mule, which is the hybrid of a donkey and a horse, is sterile. It cannot produce its own, reproduce.
Okay.
So anyway, a creation of a superhuman race would mean you can create a superhuman, but you cannot create a generation of superhuman beings.
Okay. So
I don't think right now you have the ethical guidelines to even choose a gene over some other gene, basically, right now.
That's true. Really, we cannot choose the gender of your child, right? Still,
Yeah.
and
It's
it's just one chromosome.
Yeah, the same way you can't choose, you want this characteristic in your child, you want your child to have blue eyes, you want your child to have straight hair. You cannot choose that anytime soon, the coming future. There are there's so many ethical dilemmas, ethical guidelines. It becomes a huge ethical problem at the end of the day. And right now there are no guidelines, and you're actually forbidden from doing genetic experiments on human beings like this, creating super races.
Okay, so what do you think are the biggest things to expect in medicine moving forward, Atthulyaa?
I feel regeneration is going to be a bigger thing coming in the future. Regeneration in the sense, instead of bionics as such, I'm hoping to see, regrowth of what you've lost, or faster healing times, faster,
Like
I know.
Deadpool, basically.
Okay, that's a very weird way to say it, but then yeah.
It's more into stem cell research, what Atthulyaa says, right?
Yeah. You can regenerate what you've lost rather than, using bionics and, that's also pretty developing right now. That you can see, in the past, in 10 years, you can see bionics and all that. But what I'm expecting to see further than that is all the regeneration rather. And then I expect people to live longer also in the coming days. I don't know why, but then I have a feeling people are going to live longer and look younger.
If you had been following our podcast, I think a couple episodes ago, we did one on this. We imagined a world where the average life expectancy of humans is 200. Or I think we did double. And we were talking about what we would do if we had that long to live. So do you guys think that's an actual possibility?
200 is a bit too long for the current scenario, but then, but then the current average human life is 75 for women, 72 for the average Indian man. I think it'll be extended by another 20 years, the average per se. I feel that's going to be a possibility.
That's a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you guys have anything else you want to bring up, or we can start wrapping this up? I thought this was especially informative for me. I learned a lot of things, and I hope the listeners will also get some kind of valuable input from this podcast. So do you guys have anything else to bring up, or we can start wrapping up now?
That's about it, I guess.
Yeah, that's all.
Okay, so if something else comes to my mind about medicine, I'm definitely gonna have you guys back on. And it was a pleasure to have both of you on, and thank you for being on again.